It is finally time. The playoffs are here. 8 teams compete, but only one can be crowned the Overwatch League 2021 champions. Who will it be, and who will go home empty-handed? Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Eliza, and welcome to the Overwatch Weekly Recap. In this video, we'll be talking about the play-ins, so if you haven't seen those matches, you may want to before watching this video, as this is your spoiler warning. We'll be looking at the scores and talk a bit in depth on the games, plus we'll be looking at how my predictions before the play-ins measured up. We will also be predicting the final playoff tournament. With that out of the way, let's get into the games. Now, before we get into the final tournament, we need to talk about how the final 3 teams got here. Starting off in the East, the Philadelphia Fusion had to defeat both the Hangzhou Spark and the Seoul Dynasty for their spot in the playoffs. Against the Spark, Fusion went 3-1, exactly how I predicted, and ignoring the control map Oasis, this was not a close game. And honestly, Oasis was a close map mostly due to the supports of the Spark and good neutral fights from Spark. Coldest on the Ana in particular won a couple of fights for the Spark just with a Bionade or a Sleep, but all in all, Spark were getting the right picks at the right time and were able to take the first map. But from there, the Spark had the same problems they've had all year. Bad ult usage like a nanoed Brig who then rallied in a lopsided fight, to some really bad grabs for Bernard when he, basically as he was dying. That stuff just kind of hurt the Spark so much. Hangzhou also had a ton of trouble getting any defense going, and a lot of the maps Philly was just waltzing in and taking the point. But that's not to say everything was great for Philly either. EQO is so inconsistent on the Sombra, and that really showed in this match, getting some awful EMPs, and honestly looking a lot better solo EMPing Gushwei on the Winston when he dove into the Philly backline than trying to use it offensively. But regardless, Philly was able to deal with the Spark easily and move on to their second match, the Seoul Dynasty. The Philly-Seoul game was a little bit closer, but Philly was still able to win 3-1. Now, I expected this game to be even closer and predicted a 3-2 in favor of the Dynasty. So why was my prediction off? Well, I didn't expect the Philly DPS to clutch so much. In the very first map, Control on Busan, Shockwave and Carpe were able to completely turn fights Philly had no business winning. Those two were in complete control of both points to give Philly the first map, and throughout the match, clutch plays like amazing work from Alarm getting 6-man Bionades on the Ana, and great ult usage, even from EQO Sombra, and Seoul were just not able to get much done. And part of that was Seoul's own fault. Really bad decisions from the tank line, including 2U chasing the EQO Genji, allowing Philly to put pressure on Marvel's Rhine and pick him off to get the point on Hanamura, and a rare scouting death as Marvel on the ball rolled into Nubani to see what Philly was playing, and took the quick way back to spawn rather than walking. I think this could have been a closer match and could have went either way, but Seoul decided that their last game shouldn't be their best, and Philly just wanted it more, getting the last spot in the East to move on to the playoffs. Things in the West Division made my prediction much more wrong, and boy were most of these games not close. 3 3-0s and only one game going the distance to 5 maps, and while I got one of the 2 teams moving on to the playoffs correct, the other I thought stood no chance. So with that, let's talk about the Washington Justice and the San Francisco Shock's path to the playoffs. Starting with the easier one, the Shock did pretty much exactly what I expected. But first we need to talk about the Toronto Defiant and their game against the Boston Uprising. Now, I predicted this game to be a 3-0 in Toronto's favor, and I was not disappointed. Toronto looked good in this game, with the DPS in particular doing a lot, as well as Sato on the main tank, especially when he was playing Winston. On the other hand, the DPS from Boston struggled, and the fights that Boston won were messy and expensive ult-wise. Mungbong on the support did a lot of work, but it wasn't enough, and Boston could never really get that last little effort to push the car over the line or to cap the point. I think a lot of this match came down to Toronto forcing Boston to play a more dive-style comp, which Toronto likes, over the Rhine comps that Boston favors. And if you're playing what your opponent wants, it's not going to end well. But moving on to the Shock, San Francisco was able to pick their opponent, as they were the higher seed than the Houston Outlaws, and had to decide between the winner of the Paris-Washington match, which we'll get to later, but should be obvious that it was Washington, and Toronto. Now, I couldn't read Shock's mind, even if I wanted to, but I had said in my prediction video that the Shock should probably take on Toronto if they wanted to win, and that's exactly what happened. However, my prediction of a 3-1 scoreline in favor of the Shock was wrong, as Shock 3-0'd the Defiant to move on to the playoffs. The difference between the Shock and the Uprising, however, is Shock played their game. Most of the season, the Shock have alternated between 2 main tanks, Super and Smurf, depending on the style of play that the Shock wanted to come out on. Super is the Rhine player, Smurf is the Winston player. And that's exactly what San Francisco did this match. Super played the first and last maps, playing the Rhine comps, while Smurf came in for Volskaya to play the Winston dive. And San Francisco was in complete control of this entire match. Good plays from the Shock, nice aggression, and a sneaky hiding Ana on Volskaya thanks to Twilight made this match a fairly easy one for Shock. Shock really didn't have to make any clutch plays or anything like that in this match. Just good ult usage, measured aggression, kept Toronto on the back foot, drawing out weird counter comps and comfort picks from the last map of Nubani, as Toronto was playing a Reaper Genji to counter Shock's really good anti-dive style Rhine comp. Fully held on A in Nubani and fully held on B in Volskaya, the Toronto Defiant never stood a chance. Shock moved on to take the first spot in the playoffs. And now the second spot. Up for grabs in the West, and boy was I wrong on this one. First of all, I thought Washington would be the fourth likely to get into the playoffs, but this team came out to play in the play-ins. So to start off, the Justice needed to defeat the Paris Eternal in a game I thought would be an easy 3-1 for Paris. Turned out to be a quick 3-0 for Washington. Again, a stylistic difference in the team comps, as the Justice really like playing the Winston dive with a Moria Lucio backline, as opposed to most teams who play the Ana Brig with the Winston, or like Paris, prefer to play the Zen Brig with a ball main tank. But Justice made it work, and are also eager to play the Rhine comps, as main tank Mag is one of the best Rhines in the league, stat-wise at least. In this match, however, it was all down to the DPS of Decay and Assassin. Decay played a lot of Reaper in this map to counter the Winston from Dawn on Paris, but looked great on Tracer as usual, and Assassin, who I've criticized for being horribly inconsistent, had a really great day on both the Mei and the Sombra. Fury on the Diva was also great, eating blizzards from Naga to getting remake kills on Khan on the Baptiste, and just in general stalling out the point. Paris had no chance and struggled against the Justice comp, even showing some signs of uncertainty, switching back and forth between DPS heroes. Justice dealt with Paris and moved on to the Outlaws. Against the Outlaws, the match was a lot closer. Now, I did not expect Washington to win, so I don't have a prediction, but I thought that Houston would be victorious against Paris 3-2. But in the end, Justice beat the Outlaws 3-2. In this match, Houston played nothing but dive, either the ball dive style comps or the Winston dive style, while Justice played mostly the dive with a little bit of Rhine Rush. And like the match with Paris, Justice liked playing the Moria Lucio backline style of dive against the Outlaws' more common Zen Brig with the ball dive comp or Ana Brig with the Winston comps. This match seemed like it was going to go Houston's way from the get-go, with a couple of C9s in the first three maps and really good plays from the Outlaws' DPS of Happy and Dante, including a really nice EMP from Dante, on Eichenwald I believe it was, which caught the ulting Moria of Bebe and canceled the sound barrier of Closure. But Justice never gave up, and both sides had constantly fight for control. For the Outlaws, Crimso on the support, whether it was the Ana or the Zen, completely carried maps to the point that Assassin on the Sombra would solo EMP him just to get Crimso out of the fight. And that was something I noticed, by the way, with the difference of Sombra styles. The Outlaws, especially Dante, prefer to EMP groups or sometimes just the diving Winston of Mag, whereas Assassin liked to EMP just the supports of Houston to get more or less guaranteed picks. But it wasn't the EMPs that won or lost the game, though it was the Sombra play. Assassin continually got fantastic neutral hacks on either the Outlaws' tanks or DPS, and constantly got picks off of the hacks. By the end of the map, Dante on Sombra couldn't even play because every time he decloaked, Assassin hacked him and the Justice sent him back to spawn. This was a brawl of a match, but ultimately Assassin carried Justice harder than the Crimso carried the Outlaws, and the Washington Justice made their way to the playoffs. Now, before we get to the playoff predictions, a couple of clarifications. First of all, the playoffs are currently going on. I wasn't able to get this video made and out before they started, and this is now the third day as I am recording this, so there's a lot of hindsight I'm trying to avoid. And to do that, I'm making this script on the second day of the playoffs, and apart from looking at the scores, I've not really watched the games at all until after I wrote all of this down. With that said, I made these predictions before the playoffs began, seeing how they are literally my pick'ems, and I'm going to be going through them with as little future knowledge as possible. So with that, let's get into it. Starting off, I should note that I'm going to be going by the bracket, not when the games were/are actually played. So starting off, we have the San Francisco Shock going up against the Shanghai Dragons. Now this game, I'm favoring the Dragons 3-1 over the Shock, mostly due to the sheer talent on the Dragons roster and their adaptability to different comps, as Fate is a really good main tank that can play pretty much any of the heroes as needed, but Shanghai has really shown strength in these Sombra, Tracer, Ball comps. Ultimately, Shanghai has the flexibility to take the Shock down with relative ease. Next, I have the LA Gladiators defeating the Philadelphia Fusion 3-0. This one is a little simpler. Philly has not looked good at all, and LA has an amazing DPS of Birdring and Kepster, plus Mir too, though he's a little bit further down my list of greats, a very good backline, and one of the best off-tanks in the league in space. Spoiler, I have the Gladiators winning the whole thing, so there's that too. But we'll talk about that more later on. Moving on, the Washington Justice and the Dallas Fuel will face off in what I predict will be a close match, favoring the Fuel 3-2. Ultimately, both of these teams tend to favor the Winston comps and the Ryan comps, so it's not really going to be a clash of style, but of talent. And while I like the Washington Justice DPS lineup, including Assassin, who I've been cold on in the past, I really think that the main tank is the only other part of the Justice that competes with the Fuel. Hanbin on the off tank for Dallas is so much better to me than Fury on the Justice, and I think that the Justice backline is a little bit lackluster. Doha and Sparkle are a lot more consistent than Decay and Assassin, so ultimately I think Fuel will edge the Justice out of this match. And the final first round match has the Atlanta Reign going up against the Chengdu Hunters. Now I am predicting a 3-1 in favor of the Hunters, but a little bit of hindsight for this one. I originally, and you can go check my playoff preview video for this, but I originally counted Atlanta out due to Pelican and his recent surgery preventing travel. Remember, the week before the Countdown Cup, he had emergency surgery for a collapsed lung. So I predicted things believing that Pelican would probably not play, as he'd have to play from Atlanta on high ping. Well, turns out this is not completely the case, as Pelican is currently in LA, and that's a lot better location-wise, so Atlanta is fielding him. With that bit of hindsight out of the way, Chengdu is still going to win. Atlanta really struggles against the chaotic style, as they usually like going toe-to-toe against a team and not having to deal with making comp changes reactively to what their opponent is playing, and that's what Chengdu does. Leave, Gaga, and Jinmu are too much for Atlanta to handle, and that's the main reason I have Chengdu winning and moving forward. Alright, this is getting long, so let's speed things up a bit. Next in the upper bracket, Shanghai and the Gladiators will face in what I think will be a close match going the way of LA 3-2. Ultimately, I think the Gladiators are a little bit more of a stable team that will find a way through and have the talent of Kevster and Birdring to beat the Dragons' impressive lineup. Partially as well due to the amazing backline Gladiators have in Shu, Skewed, and Moth. In the other match, the Dallas Fuel and the Chengdu Hunters will face off, and I think this one will be a close match too, going 5 maps. But I favor the Fuel in this one, 3-2. Ultimately, I think Fuel will be able to handle whatever the Hunters throw at the Fuel, mostly because Dallas rarely concedes a comp battle and will play whatever they want. Maybe we'll even see Pine, though that might be unlikely, but we'll probably see Sparkle Soldier to deal with the Echoes and Pharos Chengdu will probably bring out. It'll be close, but I think the Fuel will prevail. And then finally, the winner's final will be the Gladiators versus the Fuel, and again, I am predicting the Gladiators 3-1. Again, with the amazing backline, off-tank and DPS of the Gladiators, and the flexibility to play a variety of comps, I think the Glads will have little trouble with the talented Fuel, who are a little too reliant on clutching fights. Against a consistent team like the Gladiators, it's a lot harder to rely on individual playmaking, and that's why I see the Gladiators going to the grand finals from the top bracket. Now, down to the lower bracket, we have to start from the beginning, where the Shock will take on the Fusion, and what I think will be a blowout sending the Fusion home. I have the Shock winning 3-0. Now, I don't think Fusion is a terrible team, but the scorelines and predictions is mostly because I don't think they are a top team this year. Shock will be able to punish a lot of the mistakes Philly makes, and the the Spark and Dynasty couldn't. And while Philly have a fantastic support line, I just don't think they're consistent enough to pull out a map, let alone win. In the other first round match in the lower bracket, the Reign take on the Justice. Now, that game just finished while I was writing this, so I know how it goes, but I predict the Reign to win 3-1. Ultimately, Justice have been a team that likes the Rhine comps, and Gator on Atlanta is the godfather of the infamous Rhine comp GOATs, and so I don't think Justice really want to play that game. And ultimately, the tank line of Atlanta is just too good for Washington. Moving on to the second round of the lower brackets, the Shock will have to face the Hunters, in a game I predict will go to the Hunters 3-1. For this game, I don't think the Shock have the DPS lineup to deal with the Hunters, as Leave and Jinmu are just too good, and I worry the Shock supports will be too aggressive and get picked too often to give San Francisco a chance. The next game between the Reign and the Dragons, I predict will be an easy one for the Dragons, 3-0. For this one, I think that the Dragons are just that good and should be able to handle the Reign without too much issue. The only reason I have the Dragons in the loser bracket is because I'm predicting the Gladiators to win out, but I still think the Dragons are one of the top teams. Which then moves us to the Dragons versus the Hunters, which again I have the Dragons being victorious 3-1 for pretty much the same reason. There's too much talent and too much flexibility on the Dragons roster that I don't think the oddness of the Chengdu way will cause Shanghai too many problems. Leave on the Hunters is very good, but the Dragons have Fleta and Lip, who have continued to prove themselves some of the best all year. Which brings us to the losers finals, Shanghai versus Dallas. For this one, I predict Shanghai 3-2. Dallas will have the clutch potential for an upset in this game, but again, too much talent on the Dragons for most of the team to contend with. Dallas and Shanghai have had a nice rivalry all year, but Fleta is a godly Pharah and Echo, and unless Dallas bring out Pine, and Pine looks like he did in Season 1, I don't really see the Fuel clutching this one out on the back of Sparkle. Honestly, this one could go either way, but my prediction is Shanghai. And that leads us to the grand finals, to a rematch between the LA Gladiators and the Shanghai Dragons. And once again, I predict a close match, going the distance to at least 7, but ultimately leaving the Gladiators, the 2021 champions, with a score of 4-3. And honestly, I don't think this is going to be much of a different match than the first time, ultimately coming down to the team that is a little more comfortable and stable in the team comp. Gladiators have looked like they are peaking here at the end of the season, where Shanghai has started to look a little bit weaker, especially in the Countdown Cup qualifiers. So there are my predictions, but before we head to the outro and end this, a little quick omission on my part. I predict the Gladiators, but I have to admit, I think the Dragons, Fuel, and Hunters all have a decent chance of taking things home, and honestly, in that order. Even Atlanta is not completely out of this. I think that the Justice, and I know that one for sure, spoiler alert, the Fusion and the Shock don't have much of a chance, if any, but the competition is close. This might be the best grand finals we've ever seen. We can only hope. And with that, there are my predictions. Took me a bit longer to get this one out than I wanted, but motivation to work on things is sometimes a bit of a pain. I plan on making 2 more videos concerning the postseason, one for the playoffs themselves, and then another one after that. But I'm still going to be working on the weeks that I've missed for the recap as I get them done. So thank you so much for watching this, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!